4:14 a.m., Tucson, Arizona, April 27, 2026. 42 federal agents moved through desert darkness along the perimeter of a 14-acre compound off Interstate 10. No sirens, no headlights. K-9 units swept the eastern fence line in silence, while Diplomatic Security Service and NCIS tactical teams held position at 3 separate breach points, each covering a distinct access point on the sprawling property. Earpieces crackled with low-volume check-ins, breathing controlled, temperature 51 degrees Fahrenheit. A steady wind pushed fine Sonoran dust across the unpaved service road running parallel to the compound's eastern fence. Inside, a paint and engine refurbishment booth, 3 warehouse structures, an administrative office building, a fenced overflow lot stacked floor to ceiling with shrink-wrapped engine pallets, 240 pallets, crated and labeled, $43 million worth of high-thrust marine hardware, not going to powerboat dealers in Phoenix or Las Vegas, going to the Strait of Hormuz, going to the fast attack boat squadrons of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, which had spent the previous 4 months harassing U.S. destroyers in one of the most contested waterways on the planet. At 4:14 and 11 seconds, the breach command came through. Sonoran Marine Exports had operated out of its Tucson compound since 2018, 8 years in business. Owner Reza Benham, known to sport fishing dealers, marina operators, and powerboat enthusiasts across the Southwest as Ray, had built the operation from a 3-bay shop with 2 employees into what looked like a textbook regional success story. The compound occupied 14 acres at the edge of an industrial and warehousing zone off Interstate 10, approximately 7 miles southeast of downtown Tucson. The main warehouse building held 3 separate storage bays totaling roughly 18,000 square feet. A licensed and bonded paint and refurbishment booth occupied a separate structure at the north end, large enough to process a dozen large outboard engines simultaneously. A fenced overflow lot staged several hundred crated engine units at a time. A 1-story administrative office building connected the main warehouse to the overflow lot access road. Benham's declared business model was straightforward and perfectly legal. He sourced high-performance marine motors from distressed asset auctions across the country, estate liquidations, bankruptcy proceedings, marine dealership closures, insurance write-offs from flood or storm damage. He shipped them to Tucson, had his crew rebuild them to factory-competitive performance standards in the refurbishment booth, and resold them to power sports and marine dealers across the Southwest at prices that undercut comparable new units by 30 to 40%. Mercury Marine Outboard Blocks. Yamaha F-Series high-thrust configurations. Evinrude E-Tech units sourced from liquidated dealer inventory. Engines rated above 350 horsepower. The performance tier used on offshore sport fishing boats, tournament-based rigs, performance watercraft, and luxury center console cruisers running the coastal Southwest from Baja to the Gulf Coast. The numbers Sonoran declared to state and federal tax authorities were consistent with that model. Declared revenue last year, $42 million, 21 employees on active payroll, proper licensing for hazardous materials handling in the paint booth, commercial general liability insurance at a premium consistent with a legitimate heavy equipment dealership, workers' compensation coverage, quarterly payroll tax filings, all current. Benham drove a new F-350 diesel pickup. He sponsored 2 youth baseball teams in the Tucson metro area. He had a standing reservation every Thursday evening at a well-regarded restaurant on 4th Avenue. He appeared at marine trade shows in Las Vegas and San Diego. He had a website, a LinkedIn company profile, and a Better Business Bureau listing with a 3.8 rating. On paper, Sonoran Marine Exports was exactly what it claimed to be. The paper was the problem. The Diplomatic Security Service licensing analyst, his name withheld from public court filings and referred to throughout the indictment as the licensing analyst, had spent the previous 14 months conducting routine cross-reference audits of dual-use export applications against Customs and Border Protection shipping manifest records. It was the kind of work that produced few results in any given month. The kind of audit that ran quietly in the background of federal trade enforcement, because it had to, not because anyone expected it to break major cases. In the 3rd week of October 2025, it produced something that was not routine at all. Dual-use licensing governed equipment with simultaneous civilian and potential military application. Marine propulsion systems exceeding a defined thrust threshold had been on the dual-use monitoring list since 2014, following a review of Gulf maritime procurement patterns after the previous round of Iranian sanctions enforcement. Any U.S. exporter shipping such systems to a foreign entity was required to file a dual-use export application, identifying the end user, stating the intended use, and providing documentation supporting the civilian purpose claim. When the end user was listed as a humanitarian aid organization operating in the UAE, it triggered a standard secondary review flag, not unusual when humanitarian organizations legitimately procured emergency watercraft, but still requiring analyst approval. The organization listed on BANAM's application was Crescent Maritime Aid. Registered in the UAE in 2023, stated mission, provision of emergency rescue watercraft to underserved coastal communities across the Middle East and South Asia. 4 pending export applications from Sonoran Marine Exports, seeking approval to ship 112 rebuilt outboard engines to a warehouse address in the Jebel Ali Free Zone outside Dubai. The licensing analyst pulled the Crescent Maritime Aid registration file. The humanitarian framing didn't hold up on close examination. A legitimate coastal rescue craft procurement program would specify engine ratings appropriate for rescue launch platforms, typically in the 75 to 150 horsepower range. The engines Sonoran was applying to export were all rated above 350 horsepower, some above 400. Those are not life raft motors. They are not appropriate for the rescue launch applications the Crescent Maritime Aid mission statement described. They are combat speed motors, the kind used on platforms designed for sustained high-throttle operation in contested environments. The analyst flagged the application and requested the complete shipping history for Sonoran Marine Exports going back to January 2025. What came back stopped the routine audit entirely. 14 separate export filings, all listing rebuilt marine propulsion units as the cargo description. All listing Crescent Maritime Aid as the receiving entity. All routed through the Jebel Ali Free Zone address. Combined shipment total across all 14 filings, 240 engines, 6 weeks, 240 units, all rated above 350 horsepower, all labeled as humanitarian rescue equipment. The analyst ran the specification data Benham had included in his licensing filings through a defense intelligence cross-reference system accessible to DSS analysts under a joint Homeland Security protocol. Engine dimensions, thrust ratings, cooling port configurations, prop shaft diameters, mounting specifications. The system was designed specifically to identify dual-use equipment matching known foreign military hardware profiles, and it had been updated to include IRGC naval procurement parameters following the February escalations in the Strait. Every unit Benham had listed matched the propulsion specifications of the IRGC Mark 7 fast attack boat platform. The IRGC Mark 7 is a 40-foot composite hull, twin outboard configuration, built for speed and swarming tactics in shallow water and constrained channel environments. Since February of 2026, squadrons of Mark 7 boats had been conducting close approach harassment operations against U.S. Navy destroyers transiting the Strait of Hormuz, approaching within 300 meters, forcing defensive course alterations, on 3 documented occasions, discharging warning flares at U.S. vessels. The Joint Chiefs had convened twice to review rules of engagement parameters for strait transit operations. The analyst had just found the engine supplier for the boats conducting those operations. He escalated within the hour. The file went from DSS Washington to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service before 3 p.m. the same day. NCIS opened a parallel investigation that afternoon. What's most surprising about this case isn't the scale of the procurement pipeline. It's how cleanly it operated in plain sight for 19 months. 14 export applications, 13 approved, 168,000 pounds of marine propulsion hardware moved through a legal export filing process with proper documentation and not a single customs hold. The 14th application triggered a flag only because a single analyst happened to cross-reference 2 separate databases in the same audit cycle on the right day. 13 out of 14, 19 months. 240 engines. NCIS Special Agent Deborah Harkins took the lead assignment 2 days after the DSS escalation reached NCIS Southwest. Her 11 years at the Southwest Field Office had been focused on procurement fraud, defense contractor billing irregularities, and supply chain integrity cases involving companies doing business with the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. She understood the paper logic of how legitimate supply chains documented themselves, and more specifically, how illegitimate ones exploited that documentation structure. The first order of business was a full financial reconstruction of Sonoran Marine Exports. Not just the export filings the DSS analyst had reviewed, but the complete acquisition side picture. If Benam was purchasing engines at distressed asset auctions and channeling them through the Dubai pipeline, the volume of acquisitions should correlate with the volume of exports in a traceable way. The auction records existed. They were genuine. Benam had been purchasing used marine motors from estate sales and liquidation events across Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Texas, going back continuously to 2020. The acquisition volumes were consistent with his declared annual revenue. The prices he paid at auction were consistent with prevailing distressed asset market rates. The engines were real, the sales were real, the paperwork was real. But the engines Sonoran was buying and the engines Sonoran was exporting weren't the same engines. Harkins identified the discrepancy in the serial number logs. Standard acquisition to export auditing tracks serial numbers from incoming purchase records through to outgoing export filings, verifying that a company was selling what it bought. When Harkins's analysts mapped Sonoran's incoming auction purchase serials against the serial numbers listed on the Dubai export filings, 17 out of the first 28 check pairs didn't match. The incoming serial numbers traced cleanly. Mercury Marine and Yamaha factory serials, each traceable to original commercial manufacture and sale. Legitimate distressed asset provenance. The outgoing serial numbers, the ones on Benam's Dubai export filings listed as rebuilt Sonoran units, traced to nothing. Not to auction records, not to manufacturer databases, not to any registered commercial transaction anywhere in the United States. The incoming engines were real. The outgoing engines were real engines. They were not the same engines. Benam was maintaining two separate inventories. The legitimate auction purchase stock generated the paper trail that justified his business license, his bonding, his declared revenue, and his export application volumes. A second, entirely undocumented supply chain was providing the actual engines destined for Dubai. When a unit from the undocumented supply chain was processed through the paint booth, it came out with a re-stamped serial, matching numbers pulled from engines in the legitimate inventory that had already been sold domestically. The documented engines supported the paper. The undocumented engines filled the actual orders. The hydraulic press that K9 teams would later find in the paint booth's hidden secondary room was how the re-stamping happened. NCIS established physical surveillance on the Tucson compound beginning November 17, 2025. 3 fixed cameras mounted on commercial utility poles at easement positions bordering the property to the north and east. A mobile observation unit operating from a commercial service vehicle rotating between 3 parked positions within sightline of the main gate. Undercover agents conducting periodic drive-bys logged as standard traffic surveys. 6 weeks. Nothing that deviated from the visible rhythms of a legitimate marine equipment operation. Auction house delivery trucks, commercial freight carriers, parts suppliers, Benam arriving at 7 a.m., leaving at 6:30 p.m., 7 days a week except Sunday. Then at 1:47 a.m. on January 8, 2026, a flatbed semi-trailer arrived at the compound's north gate. No company markings. Arizona commercial plates registered to a logistics brokerage in Flagstaff. The Flagstaff entity turned out to be a shell company with no employees, no operational address, no trucks, and a UPS mail forwarding account as its sole registered contact. The flatbed offloaded 41 crated units, not through the main warehouse receiving dock, where surveillance cameras had line-of-sight coverage, through the paint booth bay doors on the north side, providing access to an interior space that the surveillance package had never been able to fully document. Those doors were almost never opened during business hours. Harkins had the flatbed's movement backtracked through commercial GPS database records and toll transponder logs. The truck had originated the previous evening from a secondary warehouse facility in El Paso, Texas, registered to an entity called Southwest Consolidation Services. NCIS cross-referenced Southwest Consolidation against DSS trade records for UAE-bound shipments. The entity appeared as a logistics intermediary on 3 of Benam's 14 export filings. 2 warrants were drafted and approved within 48 hours. 1 for the Flagstaff Shell brokerage, 1 for the El Paso warehouse. The El Paso facility was empty when NCIS agents arrived. Cleared out within the previous 24 hours, shelving stripped, loading dock cleared, every document, every inventory record gone. Someone had received advance notice that the warrant was coming. The investigation had a leak. The El Paso clearance was a serious operational setback. Harkins briefed NCIS command and DSS counterparts on January 14th. The meeting was tense. 18 weeks of surveillance work had confirmed the shell company structure and the undocumented supply chain. The El Paso facility, which likely held documentation on the full upstream procurement network, was gone. More urgently, if the El Paso network had been tipped off, Benam might have received the same warning. If Benam knew he was being watched and chose to suspend operations, he could move the 240 engines, destroy the records in the paint booth, and walk the entire operation to ground indefinitely. What investigators had already documented was sufficient for arrest and federal prosecution, IEEPA violations for each of the 14 documented shipments, potential material support charges pending confirmation of the downstream IRGC connection from the Dubai end, conspiracy to obstruct based on the El Paso warehouse clearance and the shell company structure. But DSS Washington wanted confirmation of the Dubai to IRGC link before authorizing overt action. Establishing that link required coordination with UAE financial intelligence authorities and, separately, with naval intelligence assets tracking IRGC procurement logistics in the Gulf. That coordination was in motion, but it needed time. A 45-day hold was the compromise. No overt moves. Continued passive surveillance. At the end of the window, the 2 investigative threads would converge into a unified prosecution package. Put yourself in Harkins' position at that moment. You have enough to make arrests. You know the operation has a leak somewhere. Every day you wait is a day your subject might move the engines, dissolve the company, or disappear. You've been handed a 45-day clock and told to keep watching. She held the line. In Dubai, DSS country officers working through UAE financial intelligence channels traced Crescent Maritime Aid's incorporation to a parent entity registered in Oman. The Omani registration listed a nominee director, a Muscat accountant who processed commercial incorporations for foreign clients on a fee basis, and a beneficial ownership trail that ran through 2 additional shell layers registered in Cyprus and the British Virgin Islands, before terminating in a corporate structure that appeared across multiple financial intelligence databases under IRGC procurement-associated designations. The BVI entity matched a procurement front organization that had appeared in 3 previous U.S. Treasury sanctions enforcement actions between 2019 and 2023. All 3 prior actions had involved maritime equipment. 2 had specifically involved fast attack boat components. The connection was documented. Crescent Maritime Aid was an active IRGC naval procurement channel. The 240 engines Benam had shipped over 19 months were going to the fast attack squadrons, conducting harassment operations in the Strait of Hormuz. DSS Washington sent authorization to NCIS Southwest on March 4, 2026. Proceed to operational planning. What this case reveals about how sanctions evasion functions at the procurement level is worth pausing on. The vulnerability isn't in the sanctions list itself. It's in the gap between the licensing audit cycle and the export event. Benam filed 14 applications. 13 cleared before anyone noticed. The system worked, but it worked 14 months late and 13 shipments too slow. By the time the first flag appeared, the operational pipeline had already completed most of its primary delivery goal. 240 engines, 14 months, 0 interdictions before the investigation opened. Operational planning for a compound raid at that scale required resolving 3 specific problems. First, the compound had multiple structures with separate access and no visual connection between them. A staged entry securing one building while others remained unsecured gave subjects time to destroy documentation in the unsecured spaces. The solution required simultaneous multi-point entry with no gap between breach events. Second problem, the paint booth structure had an interior layout that surveillance had never fully documented. The January flatbed delivery, 41 crated engine units offloaded through the paint booth bay doors at 1:47 a.m., implied storage capacity inside the booth beyond what was visible on the building's exterior permit drawings. Harkins's team had pulled Pima County building permit records for the structure. The drawings showed a single open bay. The delivery volume was inconsistent with a single open bay at normal packing density. Third, the overnight delivery pattern implied either regular movement of goods at unusual hours, meaning personnel with compound access in pre-dawn windows, or a deliberate off-hour scheduling pattern to minimize observation. NCIS coordinated the operational package with DSS tactical support and requested K-9 units from the Tucson Field Division. The K-9s served two purposes: contraband detection in the paint booth's undocumented interior and perimeter control on the overflow lot and surrounding fence line. The raid package was built around simultaneous three-point entry: Team 1 at the main warehouse loading dock on the east side of the building, Team 2 at the paint booth bay doors on the north side, Team 3 at the administrative office entrance on the south side. All three teams breach within a 2-second window following the breach command. No element moves until all three report ready. 22 minutes before the scheduled breach, a problem surfaced. Team 2's commander, reviewing the building permit drawings at the staging position, flagged a structural inconsistency. A satellite image taken 6 weeks earlier showed a roofline extension on the paint booth structure that was inconsistent with the permitted building footprint. The structure was physically larger than the drawings indicated. If the interior had been modified after the original permit was filed, Team 2 was entering a building whose layout was unknown. Harkins made the call. Proceed. Halting a 42-agent operation with active K-9 units at 3 breach points in darkness 22 minutes before scheduled execution wasn't realistic. The engines were staged. The subjects were on site. Any further delay compounded the risk from the existing leak. At 4:14 and 11 seconds, all three teams breached simultaneously. The main warehouse cleared in 9 minutes. 4 employees, Sonoran staff working an early morning inventory shift, were taken into custody without physical resistance. The warehouse interior matched the permit drawings: 3 storage bays containing standard commercial marine motor inventory, auction-sourced engines in various stages of rebuild, parts bins, commercial shelving with spec binders. Nothing on the warehouse floor inconsistent with a legitimate marine dealership. The paint booth told a different story. Team 2 entered through the bay doors and immediately encountered what the satellite image had implied. The interior of the paint booth had been substantially modified from its permitted configuration. Where the original drawings showed a single open refurbishment bay running the full depth of the building, the actual interior was divided. A secondary room had been constructed along the rear of the structure behind a finished drywall partition. The partition was painted the same industrial gray as the rest of the booth walls. A steel door was set flush with the partition face. Same gray paint, no visible hardware except a recessed pull handle, positioned at the far end of the bay where the overhead lighting was dimmest. From the main entry point, the door looked like a utility access panel. The K-9 unit flagged the partition wall on its second sweep pass, approximately 90 seconds after Team 2 entered. The dog hit on the door and held position. The door was not locked, it opened inward. Behind it, a climate-controlled concrete-floored secondary space, approximately 20 feet wide by 30 feet deep. Motion-activated LED overhead lighting triggered as the door opened. No windows. Along the rear wall stacked 3 units high, 7 black aluminum equipment cases, commercial transport grade, each secured with 2 combination padlocks. The kind of cases used for sensitive electronics or precision instruments in transit. Dust-sealed, shock-resistant, marked with no identifying information. On a steel shelving unit along the right wall, 2 commercial-grade paper shredders. Both had been recently used. Both still warm to the touch. Both waste bins full of shredded material. On the concrete floor in front of the shelving unit, a hydraulic press of the type used in precision metalwork operations requiring controlled tonnage. The specific application most consistent with a press of that size and configuration in that context: serial number restamping. And behind a panel along the left wall, installed to look like a standard electrical junction box housing, but in fact a concealed access door to a cavity approximately 3 feet deep, running the full length of the wall. $11 million in U.S. currency. Mixed denominations, non-sequential. Banded in $10,000 stacks and arranged in orderly rows on wire shelving inside the cavity. Harkins was in the main warehouse when Team 2 radioed the paint booth findings. She walked across the compound, crossed the main paint booth bay, and stood at the door of the secondary room. The K9 handler was holding his dog back near the entry. 2 agents were photographing the currency wall before anything was touched. There was a line in the case file from Harkins' field notation at the time. Observed approximately 11 million US dollars, non-sequential currency, not consistent with declared business revenue, not consistent with domestic retail cash transaction patterns. Cold and precise. The way federal case files read when the agent writing them has seen enough to know not to embellish what is already self-evident. What the $11 million represented was the margin between the legitimate auction purchase front and the actual pipeline's cash economics. The Dubai payments for Benam's undocumented engine supply chain moved entirely outside the U.S. banking system. Cash received, cash stored, cash moved in quantities and through channels that generated no reportable financial records. The legitimate business ran on wire transfers and commercial invoices. The pipeline ran on the false wall. The 7 aluminum equipment cases were opened on site after combination attempts failed, using bolt cutters on the padlocks. Each case contained bound document packages, shipping manifests for all 14 Crescent Maritime Aid export shipments, bills of lading for the undocumented inbound supply chain from El Paso, payment confirmation records in the form of currency count sheets and coded transfer acknowledgments that the prosecution would later map to wire transfers routed through intermediaries in Oman and Turkey. Procurement orders with specifications annotated by hand in both English and Farsi. The El Paso warehouse had been cleared before NCIS could reach it. Benam had kept complete operational documentation in the paint booth. 7 binders, 14 shipments, every transaction in the chain. I spent time going through the published case documents. The indictment runs 112 pages. And one detail in those binders kept drawing my attention. The documentation wasn't just complete, it was cross-referenced. Shipment numbers indexed against procurement orders, which indexed against the cash count records from the currency wall. It was the filing system of a man who expected to be able to look back through the chain and find any specific transaction at any time. The court motion that later described it as among the most self-incriminating evidence records encountered in any IEEPA prosecution in this district was not exaggerating. Whatever the reason he maintained it, leverage against counterparties, insurance against being cut out of the arrangement, a condition imposed by whoever placed the orders, Benham had documented everything, and everything was now in federal custody. Reza Benham was arrested in the administrative office at 4:26 a.m. He was seated at the main desk, not attempting to flee or conceal himself. His cell phone was face down on the desk in front of him. He did not speak when agents entered. The call log showed an outgoing call placed at 4:13 a.m., 1 minute before the breach command. The call had connected and lasted 22 seconds. The number was a prepaid mobile registered to a postal address in Dearborn, Michigan. Dearborn field agents reached the location, a commercial strip convenience store, within 3 hours of the Tucson raid. The prepaid phone was recovered from the store's exterior trash receptacle. Factory reset, wiped, discarded. Whoever received the 4:13 a.m. call received 22 seconds of warning before 42 agents hit 3 breach points simultaneously. 7 of Benam's crew were arrested at various locations across the compound during the sweep. 3 in the main warehouse, 2 in the paint booth's main bay, 1 in the overflow lot, walking the perimeter of the engine pallets, 1 attempting to exit through the administrative office's rear emergency door, detained by agents holding the building exterior. All 8 subjects were transported to the Tucson Federal Building. The compound was secured as a federal crime scene. The overflow lot, all 240 crated engine units, was placed under federal seizure and inventoried under controlled conditions. The inventory produced a detail the surveillance operation had not captured. Not all 240 engines were configured identically. 182 matched the IRGC Mark 7 propulsion specifications as they appeared in the DSS cross-reference database. Standard high-thrust configuration, for a 40-foot composite hull operating in the mixed salinity, variable current conditions of the Strait of Hormuz. The remaining 58 were modified variants, same base thrust specifications, but with cooling system alterations, internal gallery diameter adjustments, and additional heat exchanger capacity, consistent with sustained high-speed operation in higher ambient temperature, high salinity open sea environments. The Hormuz corridor in summer, specifically the southern approach zones where IRGC fast attack operations had been concentrated since March. Benam wasn't filling orders for generic replacement propulsion units. He was filling precise engineering specifications for specific operational environments within a specific theater of operations. Whoever placed the orders knew exactly what they were building and where it would operate. Here's the take that will probably generate some pushback. The 19 months this operation ran undetected is not primarily a failure of law enforcement. It is a structural failure of the dual-use export licensing framework. That distinction matters because the corrections required are fundamentally different. Benam filed 14 applications. 13 were reviewed and approved under the existing process. The 14th was flagged only because of a cross-database cross-reference that was not a required procedural step. It was an analyst doing more than the standard review required. Had that analyst run only the standard review, the 14th application clears, and the operation continues. The IRGC Mark 7 platform had been an active DoD concern since 2023. The dual-use monitoring threshold for marine propulsion systems was set in 2014. The gap between those two data points, a known threat platform and a known dual-use category that covers its exact propulsion specifications, should have produced an automated cross-reference flag at the license review stage years before Benam filed his first application. It did not. The indictment charges 8 people in Tucson. It does not address why 13 shipments moved without a flag. That question belongs in a different document, in a different building, in front of different officials. What do you think? Is this a failure that licensing reform can actually fix? Or is the enforcement gap structural in a way that new regulations alone can't close? Drop your answer in the comments. The prosecution was built under a joint framework between the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Arizona and the National Security Division of Main Justice. IEEPA charges across all 14 documented shipments. Material support charges, specifically material support to a designated foreign terrorist organization, the IRGC having carried that designation under the State Sponsors of Terror framework since 2019, applicable to the shipments for which the Dubai to IRGC chain had been directly documented. Conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation, tied to both the El Paso warehouse clearance and Benam's 4:13 a.m. call. The sentencing exposure under that charge stack for a defendant with no prior criminal history pointed to a range the prosecution described in pretrial filings as effectively a life sentence given the defendant's age. Benam was 51 years old at arraignment. All 8 defendants entered initial not guilty pleas. Pretrial detention was ordered for Benam and for 2 co-defendants who had held senior operational roles, one who supervised the paint booth secondary room operations, and one who had managed the El Paso inbound logistics coordination. The remaining 5 were released on electronic monitoring with travel restrictions. Within 60 days of arraignment, 4 of the 7 crew defendants had entered cooperation agreements with the prosecution. Their cooperation provided investigators with the full operational picture of the upstream supply chain, specifically the El Paso network that had been cleared before NCIS arrived. The El Paso facility had been operated by 3 individuals working under the Southwest Consolidation Services registration. They had sourced engines through a network of distressed asset intermediaries operating across 5 southwestern states, restamped serials, and shipped to Tucson on the night freight schedule Harkin's team had observed on January 8th. 2 of the 3 El Paso operators were located within 3 months of the Tucson arrests, one in El Paso, one in Las Cruces, and were taken into custody without incident. The 3rd operator, identified in case documentation as a logistics coordinator who used multiple aliases and moved between operational locations on a rotating basis, was not located before the Tucson sentencing proceedings concluded. As of the date of Benam's sentencing, that individual remained at large. The cooperation debriefs also revealed the total procurement volume. The full number of engines shipped through the pipeline over 19 months wasn't 240. That was the quantity staged in the Tucson overflow lot at the time of the raid. The complete procurement total, including shipments that had already moved through the Dubai export pipeline before the investigation opened, was 312. 72 engines, confirmed as having cleared U.S. export customs and arrived at the Jebel Ali Free Zone before investigators had any visibility into the operation, were not recovered. Their current location was not established in the public court record. 240 engines seized, 72 not recovered, 312 engines total. The upstream sourcing network details are still under seal as part of separate proceedings in the Western District of Texas. Comment more if you want to follow up when those records become public. Reza Benam was sentenced at the federal courthouse in Tucson in the final week of May 2026. The courtroom was at capacity. Before the sentence was read, impact statements were delivered by two Navy officers who had served aboard destroyers conducting Strait of Hormuz transit operations during the period covered by the indictment. Neither statement is part of the public record. The judge received them in open court. The sentence: 22 years and 8 months in federal prison. No parole eligibility under applicable sentencing guidelines. Benam was 51. The two senior co-defendants held in pretrial detention received sentences of 11 years and 9 years respectively. The four cooperating defendants received sentences ranging from 36 months to 5 years, calibrated to their operational involvement and the scope of their cooperation. Both El Paso network operators prosecuted in the Western District of Texas received sentences of 14 and 16 years. The third El Paso operator, the logistics coordinator, had not been located by the time any of these proceedings concluded. The $11 million in currency recovered from the paint booth's false wall was forfeited in full to the federal government. The 240 crated engine units were transferred to NCIS custody for controlled disposal under applicable sanctions regulations. The 14-acre compound off Interstate 10 was seized as crime proceed property under federal forfeiture statutes. Crescent Maritime Aid was dissolved by UAE regulatory authorities following a formal mutual legal assistance request. Its bank accounts, holding approximately $214,000 at the time of dissolution, were frozen. The Omani parent entity and the BVI beneficial ownership structure that DSS had traced to IRGC procurement front designations were not subject to U.S. enforcement action. Both remained active in their respective jurisdictions. One detail that stayed with me after everything else resolved: the 4:13 a.m. call, 22 seconds. Someone in Dearborn, Michigan received a warning call 1 minute before the breach. The phone was wiped and in a trash receptacle within 3 hours. The recipient has not been identified in any public court document. The Dearborn address associated with the prepaid registration was a mail forwarding service. That call, and the network it implies behind Benam's operation, has not been explained by anything in the public record. The compound off Interstate 10 is a federal crime scene. The overflow lot is empty. 240 engines are in federal custody. 72 are somewhere in a supply chain that runs from Jebel Ali to the Hormuz corridor. One logistics coordinator is still unaccounted for. One 22-second phone call to an unidentified number in Dearborn, Michigan remains unexplained. The Strait of Hormuz is still one of the most contested maritime corridors on Earth. The IRGC fast attack squadrons that have been conducting harassment operations against U.S. destroyers since February are still operational. The network in Tucson has been dismantled. The procurement demand that built it has not changed. If you want updates on the El Paso sealed proceedings when they go public, subscribe. That's where we'll post them first.